Hey guys, I am DM Zone. This is Gamers Oasis. Let's get into it. In this video, I'm going to try and hit a specific location in the original Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, I'm actually talking about hit locations in this original 1974 game, or at least the upgrade that is found within inside Blackmoor, making a deadly game even that much more deadly. But let's talk about parts of it that I could use and some of the things and some of the reasons why I wouldn't necessarily use all of it. However, we don't have to throw the hit location out of combat. Little plan. You get the general idea. Though I do wonder how much of these numbers are just arbitrary, like a guess. Probably a better guess than some people might guess, because one of the things that many people don't know is the person who made Blackmoor, really was the inspiration, the thought process behind it, was Dave Arneson. And Dave Arneson was a fencer as like a hobbyist. He would do swordplay at the college he was at, and actually was a part of a team, per se, a club, really, of amateur fencers. One of these people was Dave Wesley, and if you watch the Brownstein video, you can find out how Arneson almost accidentally killed him in a practice match. So I think the best way to cut our way through this and to get down to the point is to bring this down to a baseline and keep the expectations of this topic kind of simple versus being all noodly. It's a technical term I use when you get a lot of things that are complicated and hard to connect to each other because they wobble. And we'll have to get into how this works. There's a lot of variables that we have to take into consideration. Not everyone has got 2 legs, 2 arms, and 1 head and a torso. Some people have wings, tails, fins, for example. Some people are more horizontal than vertical. There are these type of things that we're going to have to work on and clarify. But for clarification's sake, body versus torso is basically the same. It's just, whether you're talking about a human or maybe a snake or fish or something. And we'll get into more of those as we go. So I think the normal size humanoid is a great baseline, one that we can work off. It has things we are familiar with, and it has the potential for furries or scalies or whatever. In this case, we might have winged creatures, we might have things with tails, these type of things. In original Dungeons and Dragons, they didn't necessarily have that much stuff like that, but there were creatures that had this, and that's why it's important. So we have a front, we have a side, and a rear. There is probably some expectation that you could be attacking from the top, or you could be attacking from underneath. They didn't get into this during this specific set, but you'll find that from time to time as these slides go by. So Mr. Arneson, as I said, was a fencer. He used a rapier, aka a foil, so he could master his footwork and become a little bit better at this type of stuff, probably for his own nerdy intuitions and this type of stuff. But there were probably some details that he couldn't get into. Maybe he tried, and there was probably a little bit of a rebellion. In one of Arneson's first games when he was doing playtesting, they determined that actually having hit points was important, because having a 3rd level character die because of a single hit was not fun. There were actually people who played certain characters who felt like their X level character who died in a single hit just because combat came to an end was unfair, and they stopped playing that game for several years before they came back and gave hit point a try, and then they played for decades after that, far enjoying the hit point version. So there is a point of binary or being too specific or not detailed enough that it's unfun. And on the opposite end, when you start to talk about 5% blood loss versus 20% blood loss, and the duration of this blood loss and the effects that someone might be going through, and are they starting to get hypothermic, and do they start to get blurry vision, and are their hands shaky, and do they suffer negatives? Maybe they're weak and pass out. So somewhere between too binary and too detailed, there is a place where things get bigger and better, where you see growth potential, where you get potential realized, where maybe you can be weak and now you're stronger, where foes you couldn't fight and win against before, now you can. That part of the game makes it far more interesting. So the typical humanoid has this baseline that we've talked about, and I've shown some basic stats on. There's something very similar called an avian, which is basically like a bird-like humanoid, I'm assuming. This does have wings and would be flying and has the ability to attack from above and below and this type of thing. And then you start to get into reptiles. Now, reptiles in this situation, I don't necessarily see this as lizard men. I see that more as a humanoid. When I see reptile, I'm thinking more of a quadruped, horizontal, lower to the ground type of thing. Again, dragons probably fall in reptiles and they're going to be flying. So they could have potential of wings and tails and probably an abdomen for like a top and a bottom part of the thorax, the torso area, the body area, if you want to say. We're going to get more into these statistics later, so don't get too hung up on this, but we'll get into it in a minute. Now, some of these things don't necessarily make a whole lot of sense talking about with insectoids. I feel like if you have a reptile, an insectoid's probably very similar. A fish is very similar to like a snake, but there are differences. Obviously, fish are normally swimming. They can be found in lakes and rivers, especially, and I could see this happening actually out of the water too, in like a dense fog where you have a flying fish that kind of defies gravity. In the insectoids, their hit locations are very weird, predominantly having like thorax from certain angles and then wings potentially, but from the front, it's basically, one location. And I don't necessarily like that. With the snake, they actually get into coiled and uncoiled, and I can agree with that. However, I think they could have done more with treating it like a cloaker or like something that wraps up its victim, where the potential is you could hurt the victim while it's constricting it. I think there's a lot of good opportunity in there, but if you're really trying to work for locations, I think more detail in some areas and leaving it more in the hands of a referee and not trying to say all these things have to be exactly like that. Maybe a range, or give the range and then say, referee, make the decision based upon their positioning to maybe push the torso 5% or 10% or 15% one way or the other, because more of the head or less of the head is exposed, or the abdomen, which we'll say is the underbelly, is more exposed on a dragon than the wings and back is, which are probably more heavily armored. I would also go with a completely different system that came out actually after this, if I was to put a modern spin on this. And in that system, it's called Deadlands. They had a body position called the gizzards. And the gizzards is basically a critical organ. So it would be not a headshot, but this would be like the kidneys, this would be a stomach, this would be this type of thing. And it may not even be fully defined. You just may get extra damage or some sort of thing, because kind of like, when Captain Kirk tried to kick that big monster in the knees, he didn't hit the knees because of the anatomy of the creature that he did not understand. I also think the hit points they give to each of these locations is a little wonky. It talks about the fact that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. So if you have 10 hit points, you're not actually going to take all the body parts and have that equal up to be 10. No, you would have that spread out, and you could take more damage to each location, but you would die in the process before each one of those parts got fully destroyed. They also have 3 different levels. They have mortal wounds, which I would actually have kill you in a D4 rounds, if not outright dead, because your total hit point is gone. They have accumulative damage, and then they have crippling damage, and a crippling wound or crippling damage. And I'll get into that in just a second. So the way they have it right now, and I'm sorry I'm a little bit all over the place, the way they have it right now is if you If you have 100 hit points and you take 16 hit points to your head, you're dead. If you were to drop that down to a realistic hit point total, not something like a god, basically, in original Dungeons and Dragons, to 10 hit points, that means if you take 2 hit points to your head, you're dead. That means that a single sword attack could do a D6 or a D8, depending on the sword you're doing, maybe a D10 if it's a two-handed sword. There's no chance of survival. Anything can basically kill you if it hits you in the head. For most people, that is between a 15 and 25% chance to be hit in the head. That's insane. That makes being hit in the head absolutely catastrophic. They never talk about what helms are for, but my thought is helms negate the attacks to the head. You still take the damage, but it goes to the general body, not to the head specifically, to account for the damage. But then that prevents you from actually being damaged in that area. And I think this works in other ways. You get damaged in the left arm and you have a shield. Your shield actually takes the destruction of the armor, but you still take the damage to your general body, but you drop the shield in the process. I think that type of stuff makes for a very interesting and real fight. I'm not saying this isn't close to what they were trying to do in Chainmail. I think we really are trying to get away from that at some point in time. Moving away from the war game and towards a historically fantastic game would be, I think, a great way of putting it. So where else can you be hit if you're a normal humanoid, right? Well, you have between 34 and 44% chance of being hit in the chest, the body, the torso, whatever you want to call it. This is also a place that if you take more than, and what their initial thing is, 60% of your total hit points, or if you had 10 hit points, 6 hit points, literally a D6 could outright kill you with a single hit. That's a lot. And if you take all those totals, that's up to 70% if they're attacking from behind to hit one of those 2 locations. And I really don't feel like that's fair or good. I think that's too much. There's nothing in there talking about calling for a specific location. And after playing many games with hit locations, I will tell you, people are going to want to do called shots. Vampire the Masquerade does it. Deadlands does it. All these other games do this and enjoy that type of thing. You need to have that kind of built in. So let's talk about what happens when you damage these locations. What happens? You have the mortal wound, the cumulative damage, and you have a crippling attack. Okay, so what actually is it? Well, a mortal wound kills you outright if you're struck in the head or in the torso, on basically most things. I would change that from a 15% to probably more of a 50% for the head. I would also change all the limbs to 50%. I feel like the sum of the whole needs to be, the sum of the parts needs to be way higher than the sum of the whole. That's not even anywhere near proportional. Like, the human body is way more fragile, and you don't get there by having less hit points. You just have where you get hit really matter less, and then have the potential so you can have some survivability, that your limbs can actually make it through a combat without automatically being broken, being damaged, being crippled. With a mortal wound, in my opinion, if you don't get some sort of healing spell, like some form of magic, within a D4 combat rounds, you die. That's just it. You have 10 hit points left, but you took more than 50% to your head. You're going to die unless you get the medical aid you need. I think there's a huge amount of dynamics and awe that can be created in that type of environment. Yes, it does kind of push this narrative of healers are important. Healers are a big part of the game, where they weren't necessarily a big part of the game like 5 minutes ago, right? All right, so this non-cumulative damage, which is, I really just going with cumulative damage, is where you take multiple hits in the same area, and it would probably be like 80% for the head and chest. This would be, you get hit in the head enough, you survive because you get first aid and this type of stuff, but you end up missing an eye. This is a thing that is going to linger on with you for basically a very, very long time until you get some sort of like regeneration. This is beyond a superficial wound type of thing. This is right now you have a big problem that's going to persist as you move forward. I would say that if you got hit in a non-chest location for 50% of your total hit points, so if you have 10 hit points and you get hit for 5 points in a leg, then you have some sort of thing going on. I would say that this is a lasting, lingering effect, something that you're going to probably have to get regeneration to fix. This could be broken foot. This could be blown knee. This could be a crushed hand to some degree. Not career ending, but for sure some form of damage that's going to be a difficult thing. I think there are some role-playing avenues where this could be played out. For example, you could say there's a 2 in 6 chance that the complications of your injuries give you a -1 on cold days when you're doing anything with that limb, until you get the proper healing and regeneration and rejuvenation and this type of stuff. So even after your wounds have healed, your limb has become not broken and it's been set and you've been treated by mundane magic, you forever are going to have this aches and pains to kind of deal with. But there's a way out. You could have a higher level spell cast or a quest done to get rid of that shoulder. It just kind of clicks and, bothers you all the time. It doesn't always present itself, but when it does, I think it could be very good. I also say if you could give that agency to the player for that trick shoulder to come up, I think that would be very interesting too. Now, crippling damage. They break it down like this. I think you could add a couple more layers in here, change the percents around a little bit more. But I think this is an interesting way of doing it. And the way they say this happens is this isn't continual damage. This is basically a single hit that does 80% of your torso or head. So in that situation, if you got hit in the head for 80% of your hit points, you got your life-saving magic to keep you alive. Now you're going to make it. However, in this hit, your lower jaw got completely knocked off, and now you don't have a lower jaw. There's nothing that's going to help you repair it outside of major reconstructive magic, which I think would be really cool if you actually had like monks or some sort of organization that dealt with a healing aspect of the world in this way. Body, maybe, you're disfigured. Maybe you have a permanent open gaping wound. When you breathe, people can hear the air coming in and out of your chest, and you have to avoid dusty, arid climates because you dry out and you have to have special treatment, and cold weather can be really bad too. This is a thing you're going to want to get fixed. It doesn't mean you're dead. It just means you're jacked up, you're hurt. I think this brings in a really interesting way. And if it were to hit a limb for like 50% all in one hit, you lost your foot. You lost your knee maybe. There's ways you can determine where that limb came off. You lost your hand. Again, it can be regrown, this type of stuff. But while you're under the effects, I could see reduction of movement, maybe a D6 dexterity loss if it's a foot. I think there could be social challenges as you have like a extra breath coming from your chest cavity when you breathe in cold weather. I think that not being able to use a two-handed weapon or a shield or having to have something specially made, this type of stuff could be very interesting. And there's a lot of roleplay potential with this type of stuff. So while I wouldn't use hit locations as they have them wrote in a very early, never expanded upon, tested way, I think that I could come up with several things that would be really cool, that would really make the game more dynamic with that. I mean, think about if you had someone who lost their wing while they're a dragon or something because of what they got hit, or a fairy that loses their wing. How socially awkward would that be for that fairy? I think there's some pretty cool stuff. Never mind the fact that you now have a nemesis. Oh, ho, ho, ho. The creature that would be coming after you for that. Oh, Oh, the hatred, the vitriol, the anger one would get, it would straight turn him into a red cap or something, you know? Bring him back to like a Celtish elf, if you know anything about them, or, you know, something of that nature. Anyways, guys, what do you think I got right? What do you think I got wrong? Are you considering using this moving forward in your campaigns? Let me know down in the comments down below. Thank you. Have a great day. Keep rolling those dice. Bye.